The most recent statistics from the Pew Research Center indicate that there were about 11.3 million unauthorized persons in the United States in 2013. That's a slight drop from the high of about 12.2 million in 2007. In terms of what states and where these folks are located, 6 states account for about 60% of the unauthorized immigrants in this country: California, Texas, Florida, New York, New Jersey, and Illinois. Probably no surprises there. But the representation needs are acute in many other areas, including remote and rural areas, even within cities for isolated communities, as well as in immigration detention. About 1.5 million are estimated to be eligible for what's known as DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or Dreamers, as some of us would think of them. About 3.7 million have been estimated to potentially be eligible for deferred action for parents of Americans and lawful permanent residents, which some of you may have heard is being called DAPA. So if and when that moves forward, we're looking at millions more applications and renewals potentially, and people who will be in need of some kind of assistance and some kind of legal guidance as they go through the process. There are also over 440,000 people in immigration courts now, and that number is rapidly rising. Immigration proceedings are adversarial proceedings. The government's represented in essence by a prosecutor. They're very difficult proceedings for people to navigate on their own, and about 50% navigate those proceedings now without a lawyer. You can imagine a child in a courtroom in that kind of setting. That's just, mind-blowing. Or for someone who's tortured or traumatized and doesn't speak English, a very, very difficult process. There are thousands of unaccompanied children, as you all know, who arrived in this country last year, about 60,000. The numbers dipped a bit this year, looks to be going down. As well, thousands of mothers with children. The ABA, under President Hubbard's leadership, has launched a working group to help address the representation needs of those children. So some of you may be very familiar already with those representation needs and maybe even representing some of those children yourselves. The Immigration and Naturalization Act says that representation can be provided at no expense to the government. And I'm not going to talk now about what that actually means and doesn't mean, or where Civil Gideon is on the issue on this issue. I'll never stop. But the reality is that with very few exceptions, the U.S. government does not fund representation for people in immigration proceedings. There have been some great initiatives more recently, particularly with respect to unaccompanied children and the sponsoring of AmeriCorps Justice initiatives, that are leading to some innovations and potentials for funding for some representation in this area. So that's an exciting development, and we'll have to see how that goes. There's very limited private foundation funding as well. For immigrants, these challenges are compounded by the realities that they face. One of the hugest challenges they face, as you can imagine, is language. Even if a lawyer does speak the same language as their client, they will need the assistance of a trained interpreter. Poor quality interpretation and well-meaning friends who try to help translate can lead to all kinds of misrepresentations in government documents that can doom their ability to stay here in this country with their family in the future. Securing competent interpreters is a huge challenge for legal groups. Some people can volunteer their time, but most need to be compensated. It can also be difficult to even locate interpreters that speak some of the more unusual languages. Training and confidence in confidentiality requirements for interpreters is also key. Another challenge is reaching out to those who might be in need of representation. Some, as I mentioned, are located in very remote areas. Some are held in immigration detention. Community-based centers are key in reaching geographically or otherwise isolated communities. Whether we're talking about a church-based group in Montana or an informal political association that helps Bhutanese refugees in New York City. These kinds of networks can and do play critical roles in identifying individuals who may be in need of representation and attempting to connect them up with lawyers or legal groups or at least community groups that can help them find legal representation potentially. Immigration detention is a huge impediment to representation. Only about 20% of people held in immigration detention are actually represented. The facilities where immigrants are held are often far from areas where pro bono attorneys might even be located. When the mothers and children started coming to the southern border, the government hastily erected a makeshift detention facility in Artesia, New Mexico. It's 4 hours from Albuquerque and 4 hours from El Paso. I know I drove it. There were no lawyers in that area that could actually represent these individuals. As we speak right now, pro bono lawyers who are trying to represent mothers and children held in detention centers in Texas are struggling with access issues. Everything from being denied the ability in some cases to bring in paper or all kinds of advanced approvals to actually go into the facility to things that as we look forward and look at technology, raise real questions. They need to bring in their laptops. They're taking detailed information from people about their histories of trauma and persecution and violence. If they can't type this up, that doubles the amount of time they have to spend, and that means they can help less people. Also, they desperately need interpreters. Sometimes they can bring an interpreter with them, but they're not being allowed to bring in their iPhones, which they could use potentially to pull in an interpreter by telephone to facilitate those conversations. So that's actually going on literally as we speak. Another huge challenge is the increasing complexity of the law. Some of this is the evolution of case law, but a lot of it is year after year after year of new requirements in the statutes. And some of them make sense, but some of them are just more and more requirements that have made the law so technical and so confusing that people who everyone really does agree should be eligible often are not, or can only prove their eligibility after multiple rounds of litigation. That's simply a waste. Finally, many lawyers are targeted by unscrupulous lawyers or non-lawyers who purport to provide legal representation. Immigrants are easy prey for fraudsters, as they're often hesitant to come forward to authorities to complain. They are isolated often by language and by their unfamiliarity with the United States and the US legal system. So what are some key steps and innovations for the future? I know we're going to talk about this in depth coming up, but first and foremost, there need to be more innovations in terms of providing funding for representation from the federal government, building on some of the recent initiatives. And there's been exciting things going on at the state and local level here in California under the leadership of the Attorney General here. There were some funds for representation of children. And also in New York City, some of you are probably familiar with the work of Judge Katzman and the New York Immigrant Study Group there, and the launch of the New York Family Unity Program, which has funded representation for families in New York City. Accessing language is huge. How can technology be used better to enable interpretation to be facilitated in remote areas, in detention centers, or to community groups on a regular basis and much more easily? Another huge challenge, access to justice could be really, oops, am I running out of my time? Yeah, okay, so I'm not going to go on too long with my suggestions. I will just throw out one caveat. When thinking through, how do we use technology to help immigrant communities? One key point is that many of these people are survivors of torture and trauma and abuse. So building that relationship of trust is critical. If you don't get out information or if there are omissions, those things down the road could end up hurting people in their applications. So how do you use technology to help without and still develop that relationship of trust, which often has to be done face by face?